The lantern had no memory of when it was first lit. It simply burned, not brightly, not faintly, just enough to be noticed by anyone passing through the bend in the road where no one passed anymore. The flame inside it swayed not with the wind, for there was none, but with something subtler, like breath remembered or a sigh suspended in time. The post it hung from was old wood, splintered in places, but never rotted. Moss crept up its sides like time trying to forget, yet the structure held, perhaps not by force of material, but by force of intention. It stood at the edge of a forgotten village, just before the path gave way to the forest. The forest had long stopped growing. Trees stood in stillness, their branches frozen in a posture of waiting, as though they too kept vigil. No birds sang there, no leaves fell. Only the lantern moved, ever so gently, flickering to its own rhythm. To those who might glance from afar, it would appear ordinary, a light for safety, a beacon for travelers. But no one came any more, and the roads that once curved gently around that lantern had straightened with disuse and become part of the ground itself, as if embarrassed to have ever led anyone anywhere. The house nearby had windows that looked out only at the lantern. Not the stars, not the road, not even the mountains in the distance, only that flame, and what it might one day mean. Its curtains had not been drawn in years, yet the dust never gathered on them. The door creaked open once every season, as if the house itself breathed to check if something had changed. Then it closed again, quiet and unsatisfied. No locks were needed here, no fear lived here, only waiting. No one in the nearby town remembered who had built the lantern or why it was still lit. Some said it was an old promise. Others called it madness, a ritual left behind by someone who never returned. Children were told to leave it alone, not out of superstition, but out of respect. Some things aren't meant to be touched, they'd say. They're meant to finish what they started. Yet nothing ever started, and nothing ever finished. The lantern kept burning, day after day, year after year, through storms that never blew, through nights that never felt cold, through silence that grew heavier than darkness itself. Even the flame never changed. It did not grow when fed by memory, nor shrink when surrounded by forgetting. It simply stayed, as if it too were waiting. In the mornings, when the sky turned a color that wasn't quite gold but not yet gray, the lantern would catch that light and reflect it back. Not brilliantly, not like fire, but with a hush, like an acknowledgement. It never tried to outshine the dawn. It merely greeted it, like a quiet nod from an old friend who had no new stories to share. The flame within didn't flutter like other flames. It curved, as if listening. And perhaps it was, listening not to sound, but to presence. The subtle shift in the air that might suggest a footstep, a breath, a pause that didn't belong to wind or weather. The trees nearby bent slightly toward it, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that their branches were drawn to the warmth, or to the story the lantern refused to tell. Roots spread beneath it like pages half read, waiting for a hand to turn them. Once, long ago, a traveler had come upon the lantern during a rainless storm when the sky wept without clouds. He stood for hours beneath it, unmoving, as if the light had reached into a corner of his memory that he'd sealed away. When he left, he didn't look back, but something in the flame had changed for just a moment. A shimmer, a tilt, as if recognizing someone who almost stayed. The garden around the house remained untended yet strangely ordered. No weeds grew where the cobblestones had once made paths. No vines climbed the sides of the home, as if nature, too, had agreed to preserve the silence. Only one plant thrived, a pale flower that bloomed year-round, with petals that never fell, and no name anyone remembered. It faced the lantern, always, even on days with no sun, even on nights where the sky offered no moon. It tilted toward that soft flame like it remembered a voice tied to it. No one had dared to touch the lantern in decades. The last who tried was a boy who believed in tests, who thought courage meant defiance. He reached up and placed his hand on the glass. Not hot, not cold, But the moment lingered on his skin like the weight of an unanswered question. He didn't speak of it afterward, didn't return, but he never lit another fire again. Even on winter nights, even when others shivered. He said warmth wasn't always a blessing. There were those who said the lantern should have gone out by now, that no oil lasted that long, that no wick burned endlessly. But they forgot. Some fires don't burn with fuel. Some are lit by something else entirely. And those flames, once lit, don't ask to be understood. They only wait to be seen. The seasons changed, though not in the way calendars marked them. In that part of the world, the difference between spring and fall was less about temperature and more about the way shadows stretched. Birds passed overhead, but never perched nearby. Their flight paths curved gently around the clearing where the lantern stood, as if guided by something they couldn't name but instinctively honored. Even the insects avoided it, not out of fear, but as though they, too, sensed the boundary of a story they were not part of. At night, the lantern glowed with a softness that didn't reach far. It wasn't meant to light the way. It was meant to hold space. Like the whisper of someone who had once meant everything, now reduced to a ritual gesture of remembrance. The nearby window caught its light and held it, not with glass, but with memory. Dust never settled on that sill, though no hand had wiped it clean. It remained pristine, like a frame around something sacred, something unfinished. The room behind it remained untouched. No furniture had been moved, no footprints on the floor, no creaks from the boards. Yet it didn't feel empty. It felt paused. Inside, the air was thick, not with neglect, but with expectation. A single chair faced the window. Not aligned perfectly, just slightly askew, as though someone had risen from it in the middle of a thought. The cup on the side table bore no stains, no cracks, no signs of use. Yet it had always been there, full of nothing, but never empty. A coat still hung on the wall, its fabric unfaded by time, untouched by moth or mold. It was not protected. It was respected, as if the air around it had made a pact not to disturb its shape. The floor beneath the lantern outside was worn, not from recent footsteps, but from the erosion of hope. A path created by the idea of return, not the act. Stones placed with care, not logic. They curved slightly inward, forming an arc that never completed its circle. It was a path that waited to be walked again, not by many, not by travelers or pilgrims or seekers, but by one, only one, the one who never promised to come back, but who was expected all the same. No names were written anywhere, no initials carved into the post, no dates etched in stone, but there was a presence, palpable and still. It was in the way the air cooled just enough when you stepped closer, as if adjusting itself for someone else's comfort. In the way the lantern tilted ever so slightly, not to one side but forward, as if leaning into the future that hadn't arrived, the kind of forward that wasn't movement, but faith. Sometimes the mist would come, not often and never thick, but just enough to soften the edges of the world. It would rise from the soil gently, brushing over the stones, curling around the base of the lantern post, and pressing lightly against the windowsill as though asking to be let in. It carried no chill, no dampness, no scent. It came like memory, unexpected, half-formed, and always familiar in ways that couldn't be explained. The flame within the lantern didn't flicker when it arrived. It burned steadier, as though recognizing something it had seen before. There were no records of who first lit the lantern. No ledger, no diary, no legend whispered around campfires. Only the sense that it had always been there. Some said it marked a boundary. Others believed it was a signal, a kind of call only one person could hear, but most had simply stopped wondering. In a world that moved faster each year, some places remained still on purpose. This was one of them. And the stillness here wasn't absence. It was waiting, stretched over time like a shawl left draped across a chair that no one sat in anymore, but no one dared to move. The ground around the lantern had settled in the shape of absence. There were no fresh footprints, no bicycle tracks, no signs of tools or care, but nothing ever grew too wild. Grass stopped at a respectful distance. Leaves blew in, then turned back. It was as if the earth itself had agreed not to intrude. Once, during a year when storms raged farther south and rivers changed course, a strong wind had passed through the area. Roofs cracked, trees fell. But the lantern didn't move, not even a sway. People in town whispered that it had been protected, but no one said by what or by whom. Sometimes people passing through would stop briefly on the outskirts of the forest, gaze toward the glow in the distance, and then continue on, vaguely unsettled without knowing why. They felt perhaps that something was being asked of them, and they didn't have the answer. Or maybe they sensed they weren't the ones expected. The lantern never dimmed at their presence. It didn't reach for them. It simply burned, with the same posture of quiet refusal. Or was it hope? In the attic of the house beside the lantern, there was a box. Nothing unusual, not hidden, not locked, just resting beneath a window that hadn't been opened in decades. The box was covered in a cloth that hadn't gathered dust. Inside were things no one would consider valuable. An old scarf, a tin of dried petals, a small notebook with only one sentence written on the first page. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, paused between each word as though uncertain if they were allowed to be written at all. It said, "I never said I'd return, but I also never said I wouldn't." That was all. The rest of the pages remained blank, but not empty. They felt full, like something had been erased, or like they were waiting for someone else to complete them. The ink had not faded. The paper was not yellowed. It had simply stayed, like the flame, like the post, like the quiet. Downstairs, the walls of the house bore no pictures, no portraits of smiling faces, no mementos of years gone by. But if one looked closely, they might notice faint outlines where frames had once hung, as if they had been removed not in anger or grief, but in preparation, as if the house wasn't mourning a departure but making space for a return, the kind of return that might happen tomorrow, or never. The clock in the hallway still ticked, but its hands never moved. They pointed eternally to the same moment, just before dusk, the hour of maybes, the time when promises feel closest, when the world briefly forgets that most waiting ends in silence. No one wound the clock. No one needed to. It wasn't measuring time. It was holding it. The lantern outside mirrored this, burning not as a marker of hours past, but as a witness, not to events, but to the absence of them. A flame lit not to signal presence, but to honor the possibility of it. And perhaps that was its only purpose, to keep space sacred for a person who never promised to fill it. One winter, snow fell in soft, apologetic flurries. It did not bury the lantern. It circled it, forming a perfect ring of untouched white. The post remained dry. The flame glowed warmer somehow, though the air bit harder than usual. Footprints appeared that year. Not new ones, but very old ones that the snow revealed briefly before covering again, as though the ground remembered what the mind had forgotten. They didn't lead from anywhere. They didn't go anywhere. They simply existed in place around the lantern, then vanished. Inside the house, the door opened on its own that winter, not wide, just enough to suggest an invitation. The wind did not push it. The latch did not slip. It opened like breath after holding still too long. A moment later it closed again. Nothing entered, nothing left. But the floor creaked softly, like it sighed. The lantern outside flared slightly in response. Not brighter, just fuller, like a story that remembered its next sentence but didn't speak it aloud. And then all returned to stillness. The nearby village by then had changed. New houses, new names. The old road no longer appeared on maps. Children no longer asked about the light in the woods. Stories, after all, fade when not retold. But the flame did not care. It did not need belief to persist. It did not burn for recognition. It burned because it had once been asked to, by someone whose name no longer echoed, but whose absence still did. No one knew how many years had passed. But every time the wind changed direction or the sky held its breath before rain, someone, somewhere, would feel a brief warmth on the back of their neck, as if something remembered them. Most would dismiss it. Some would pause. A few would weep without understanding why. And the lantern would burn a little longer. In a town far enough to forget the shape of the old road, but close enough to see the mountains that guarded it, there lived an old man who kept waking at the same hour every night. He did not dream, or if he did, the dreams vanished too quickly to recall. But he always awoke with a heaviness in his chest. Not pain, not fear, just weight. He would sit at the edge of his bed, eyes fixed on a window that revealed nothing but the quiet stretch of empty land behind his home. And every time, without fail, he would glance at the far end of the room, where a coat hung on a wooden peg. It was not his coat. It had never been his. He never spoke of the coat, nor did he ever move it. It was as though he believed someone else still might. He couldn't say where it came from or why it remained. He had once tried to take it down years ago during one of those restless midnights that felt like they might swallow him whole, but his hand had paused midway, not from superstition or fear, but from something quieter, respect maybe, reverence, the kind one feels standing before a grave whose inscription has faded, but whose presence still speaks. The neighbors knew him only as the quiet man who didn't ask for much. He tended his small garden, always leaving the patch closest to the gate untouched. He listened more than he spoke. Children avoided the edge of his yard, not because he was unkind, but because something about that corner always felt like it belonged to someone else. Dogs would pause near it, ears tilted, before deciding to walk around. Birds never perched on that side of the fence. The sky above it seemed slightly paler, even on the sunniest days. Once, during a village gathering, someone asked him if he had ever been beyond the hills. He looked up as if the question had brushed against an old thread in his mind, one he had almost forgotten was there. Then he shook his head gently, not in denial, but in dismissal, like someone who had once waited for something beyond the hills and no longer needed to know what it was. He did not say yes or no. He simply returned to peeling an apple, his fingers moving with the practiced stillness of someone who had nothing left to chase, but much left to hold. And that night, as always, he woke at the same hour, sat by the bed, looked toward the coat, then out the window. But this time, a flicker of light danced at the far edge of the horizon. Faint, almost not there, not a star, not a lamp, but a warmth he hadn't seen in years. His breath caught, not because he recognized it, but because something in him did. The next morning the old man moved slower than usual, not because of age, but because of something more cautious, as though stepping too quickly might break the thread of whatever had stirred the night before. He didn't speak of the light to anyone, but his routine shifted slightly. He lingered longer in the garden, eyes often fixed toward the hills, though he never ventured beyond them. He began leaving the gate ajar, a habit he had never indulged in before, and the patch of earth closest to the path, once bare, started growing something pale and soft, though he claimed not to have planted it. The townspeople noticed the changes in quiet ways. The grocer said he had started buying less food, as if expecting fewer days to come. The baker noticed he smiled more often, though always at things that weren't there. A child once wandered too close to the edge of his fence and claimed to have heard humming, not from the man, but from the wind near the gate. The child never went near again, but he also never forgot the tune which seemed to follow him into his dreams for weeks after. The coat on the peg remained untouched, but it began to cast a shadow that hadn't been there before. Only during certain hours, just before dusk, it would stretch toward the door, never farther, never less. Visitors said the room felt warmer on those evenings, like a fire had recently been lit, though no firewood had been burned in years. And on the window pane, a faint outline began to appear. 2 fingertips, pressed gently against the glass, as if someone had once stood there, watching the same hills. The light at the edge of the horizon never came closer, but it never vanished either. It hovered in the same place, steady and patient. The man began to rise before the hour of waking, just to sit and wait for it. He never seemed disappointed that it hadn't moved. On the contrary, he looked more certain with each day, as if the very act of waiting had meaning again, as if being still was not the same as being forgotten. And though he never spoke of it, he began to hum softly in the evenings, a tune that matched the one the child had described. It wasn't sad. It wasn't hopeful. It was familiar, like something once heard in the presence of someone worth waiting for. On the third night, the air shifted. Not a storm, not a breeze, just a deepening of stillness, like the world had paused to listen. The old man, seated as always by the window, noticed that the light on the horizon flickered differently this time. It wasn't stronger or closer, but it wavered with rhythm, like breathing. He leaned forward slightly, not with urgency but with recognition, the way one does when hearing a voice they haven't heard in decades but still remember the shape of. He didn't rise. He didn't speak. He simply stayed there, eyes fixed on the pulse of that faraway glow. Outside, the garden remained undisturbed, yet the flowers had begun turning toward the gate, even those that bloomed only at night. The wind chimes by the doorway, long silent from rust and disuse, gave a single, soft note, then quieted again. The sound didn't echo. It landed in the room like a thought, fully formed but unspoken. The man turned his head slightly, acknowledging it, and for a moment his hand lifted toward the coat on the wall, not to take it down, but just to be near it. He stood then, slower than usual, and moved to the kitchen, where he filled a small tin cup with water. He placed it carefully by the door, next to a pair of shoes that hadn't been worn in years. Not his shoes, not anyone's anymore. But still they waited, their leather faintly creased, as though remembering steps never completed. The cup sat beside them like an offering, not to the past, but to the path itself. That night, he didn't return to bed. He sat by the door instead, wrapped in an old shawl whose scent had long faded. His breath was steady, his eyes half closed. Not asleep, not alert, just present. And for the first time in many years, the house made no sound. No ticking from the broken clock, no creak from the beams, not even the faint hum of pipes cooling in the night. It was as if the structure itself had stilled its breathing to listen better. Outside, the lantern at the edge of the forgotten forest flared once, not brightly, not urgently, just once, like a nod, like a whisper felt more than heard. And far away, the faintest warmth brushed against the back of the old man's neck, the way sunlight sometimes kisses you through a curtain you thought was closed. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He already knew. By morning, the house seemed different. Not in any way that could be named, but in a way that could be felt. The floorboards no longer creaked beneath the man's steps, as though they had accepted his movement as part of their own. The air was lighter, touched with the faint scent of something long forgotten, perhaps lavender, or maybe just the memory of it. The birds that usually flew wide arcs around his home now paused on the fence, quiet, attentive. Even the sky held a softer hue, the kind that makes one question if they've woken into a dream, or if the dream had always been real. The old man moved through his home like someone preparing for guests, though he expected none. He straightened the books on the shelf without reading them, smoothed the shawl over the back of the chair, adjusted the cup by the door though it hadn't been touched. Every gesture felt less like tidying and more like remembering. He placed a candle on the table and lit it, not because it was dark, but because some lights are meant to be companions, not solutions. As the day passed, the rhythm of time stretched. Hours folded into one another like pages pressed too tightly together. The village beyond carried on unaware. Children ran through fields, church bells marked noon, carts rolled along familiar paths. But inside that little house, something had turned inward. The man did not wait by the window that evening. He opened the front door and stepped just beyond the threshold. Not far, just enough to feel the ground, to face the horizon where the light had always stayed. He looked not at the light itself, but at the space between them, the road, the hills, the invisible thread that connected 2 points, not by distance, but by intention. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, shoulders at rest. He wasn't hoping. He wasn't doubting. He was simply present, the way a lantern is present, not because it must be, but because something once asked it to be. And when the sky began to fade into that quiet, unnameable color between dusk and night, He nodded gently toward the horizon. Not to summon, not to signal, just to acknowledge. A greeting made of silence. That night, the coat on the wall rustled, just once, not as if touched by wind, but as if remembering the shape of the one who once wore it. The fabric swayed slightly, then settled again. The shoes by the door were perfectly aligned now. No one had moved them, and yet they stood with more purpose, as if prepared for something more than waiting. The tin cup remained full, though no one refilled it. A single droplet clung to the rim, trembling without falling. The lantern in the distance continued its slow, unwavering glow. But in that moment, something subtle changed around it. The trees, which had long frozen in their stillness, leaned ever so slightly inward. The earth beneath the post softened, not visibly, but in spirit. Even the moss on the wood seemed to recede, as if making room. The flame inside bent forward for a breath, then returned to its upright posture, not altered, but acknowledged. In the attic of the house, the old box stirred, not opened, not disturbed, just stirred, like something inside had shifted without being touched. The scarf within unfolded slightly, revealing a corner of the notebook that had long remained closed. The pages didn't turn. They didn't need to. The weight of words never written spoke louder than ink. And downstairs, the old man sat once again, this time not in the chair by the window, but on the floor by the door. He leaned his back against the wall, eyes closed, not asleep, but closer to dreaming than waking. His breathing matched the rhythm of the flame, though he could no longer see it. In his hand, he held a match, unused, not to light anything, just to hold, just in case. That hour, just before sleep claims everything, stretched longer than usual, and in its silence, something passed through the house. Not a ghost, not a breeze, not even a thought. Just presence, gentle, familiar, without need for words. By dawn, the candle on the table had burned low. Its wax pooled gently into the wood grain beneath it. The room held the scent of spent light, a warmth that doesn't come from heat, but from witness. The man was still seated by the wall, now resting fully, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The match had rolled away from his palm and lay beside him, unstruck, gleaming faintly in the morning light. Outside, the garden had begun to change. The pale flowers, which had always tilted toward the gate, now faced the open door. The path, once uneven with time and wear, seemed subtly reformed, as if guided by unseen feet. The air was unusually still but full, like the quiet after a song ends, where silence carries the last note longer than the sound itself. And across the hills, near the forest edge where the lantern stood, the flame grew softer, as though exhaling. The post no longer leaned. The moss pulled back. The circle of snow around its base melted not from temperature, but from knowing. For a brief moment, the flame curled inward, dimmed, then returned, not as a beacon, but as a memory. A soft persistence. A thank you. No one in the village noticed the change. No one asked why the old man no longer came to market. His gate remained open, the coat still hung, the shoes stayed where they were. But within the quiet of that house, something had been completed, not ended, just fulfilled. And the lantern, ever watchful, ever waiting, no longer burned with longing. It simply burned with peace. The lantern's flame did not change color, yet it no longer felt the same. Where once it burned like a question, it now glowed like an answer, one that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The air around it held a hush, not the kind born from emptiness, but the kind that follows understanding. It still swayed gently, not from wind, but from breath. Except now, the breath seemed shared, as if something unseen had come to sit beside it, shoulder to shoulder, not speaking, only being. The forest behind it, always silent, now hummed faintly in the roots, a vibration that could only be felt if one was quiet enough to listen with their bones. The house by the path had settled deeper into itself, not crumbling, not worn, just resting. The curtains at the window, untouched for so long, began to sway, though the windows were sealed. The chair by the table, slightly askew for decades, now aligned perfectly with the edge of the room, as if someone had finally returned to finish the thought they had risen from long ago. The scarf in the attic no longer lay in folds. It draped gently over the edge of the box, like a gesture of farewell offered by something that never had hands. In the town beyond the hills, people began to speak of the old man in past tense, though no one could remember the day he was last seen. His house remained untouched, not because it was guarded, but because no one felt right entering. Children walked slower when passing it, often glancing toward the distant hills without knowing why. One girl said she saw the lantern glow during the day, but her mother simply smiled and told her not to make up stories. Yet that night, the mother lingered by her window longer than usual, eyes fixed on the horizon, wondering if perhaps the story hadn't been made up at all. The lantern did not brighten. It did not dim. But the trees nearby bent closer, and the path beneath it seemed smoother, as though it had finally been walked again. The post no longer leaned forward in yearning. It stood straight, as if it now bore the memory of arrival instead of the weight of waiting. The flame inside was steady, kind. Not a warning, not a beacon. Just a light, for anyone who might still remember what it meant. And in the hours just before dawn, when most of the world drifts between forgetting and waking, the lantern held its glow with a softness that welcomed both. It didn't ask for recognition. It didn't need belief. It only offered a place to pause, for those who had come, for those who never did, and for those still walking their way there without knowing why. Far beyond the village, beyond even the reach of stories passed down in whispers, a traveler stepped off a narrow path that no longer appeared on maps. He did not know why he turned there. He only felt the pull, not strong, not urgent, but persistent, like the quiet certainty that you've forgotten something important and it's waiting just around the bend. His boots, worn thin at the edges, pressed softly into soil that had not known footprints in years. The trees grew denser as he walked, but they did not obstruct him. They moved aside gently, as if parting for someone who had once promised to return, and whose silence had been understood as patience. He walked without haste, without expectation. The air grew quieter with each step, but it was not oppressive. It was reverent, the kind of quiet that wraps around a person rather than weighs on them. He did not check the sky, though the light was fading. He did not worry about where he would sleep. Each step brought with it the feeling of approaching something he had never named, but always known. The kind of knowing that lives in the corners of dreams and in the space between heartbeats. Eventually, he reached the edge of a clearing, and there, waiting, not grandly, not like a revelation, but like an old friend sitting where you last left them, was the lantern. The flame inside swayed once, gently, as if adjusting to the presence of something long familiar. He did not rush forward. He simply stood there, allowing his eyes to adjust not to the light, but to the memory that stirred behind it. A memory not of places, but of feelings, of warmth, of not being alone. He stepped closer, and the ground beneath him felt softened, as though it had once held his weight and remembered it kindly. The post stood tall beside him, no longer bearing the lean of longing. He raised a hand, not to touch, but to hover, and the warmth of the flame met his skin before contact, not burning, not flickering, just meeting him halfway, as if to say, "It's you," or maybe, "Welcome back." He sat down beside the lantern, the way one might sit beside a fire at the end of a long journey, not seeking heat, but companionship. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence between them was enough. It was full, complete. He remained by the lantern through the night, unmoving, yet not restless. Sleep did not come, but neither did weariness. It was as if his body had remembered how to rest without closing its eyes. Around him, the forest seemed to lean in, not intrusively, but like old companions gathering in a circle to listen without needing a story. The trees made no sound, but their presence was felt. like the gentle attention of someone who once promised to listen and had never stopped doing so. In the dim hours before dawn, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slip of paper, folded many times over. Its edges were softened, as though it had been handled often. He didn't unfold it, just held it in his lap, fingers brushing over the crease, a gesture more about memory than message. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, brief, low, final. And the flame in the lantern lifted slightly, then settled again, like a breath taken beside someone you trust. He looked at the flame, not to study it, but to let it see him. In that quiet exchange, something passed between them. Not understanding, not answers. Just recognition. The kind that doesn't require a beginning or an end. He placed the folded paper beneath the base of the lantern, then rested his hand on the earth, palm flat, as if to assure it that he was here now, fully. And in return, the ground beneath him warmed faintly, not from heat, but from welcome. When the sun finally rose, it did not startle him. It touched the clearing slowly, gently, painting gold over moss, bark, and stone. The light did not overpower the lantern. It wrapped around it, like a second flame born from the first. And the man, eyes open, heart quiet, remained still, just long enough for the world to know he had returned. The folded note remained under the lantern, untouched by dew or wind. No one read it, but if they had, they might not have understood its meaning. Not because it was cryptic, but because it spoke in the language of pauses, of spaces between words. It said what most letters never dare say. You didn't have to ask. I came back because I remembered. A sentence not addressed to anyone in particular, and yet to someone unmistakable. The forest made no announcement of his arrival. The trees did not part dramatically. The earth did not tremble. But the birds began to sing again. Not loudly, not in chorus, but softly, like a memory tuning itself back into place. Petals opened where no flowers had bloomed in years. The grass beneath his feet pressed downward, not from weight, but from acknowledgement. And the lantern, still burning, still quiet, flickered once more, with the calm of something that had finally been heard. Back in the town beyond the hills, a woman awoke from a dream she couldn't quite remember, though it left her with tears she didn't feel ashamed to cry. She sat in her kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, and whispered thank you, without knowing why. In a different house, a boy who never knew the lantern drew it anyway, with remarkable detail, in the corner of his math notebook. He didn't remember doing it, but kept the page folded inside his backpack for years. The flame no longer waited, it simply glowed. No markers were ever placed at the edge of the clearing. No signs, no plaques, no names etched into stone. And yet, travelers began to arrive. Not many, and never in groups. Always alone, always without reason they could explain. Some stayed for only minutes, some for hours. None spoke aloud while they were there. A few wept. Most simply sat. One woman left a smooth stone by the post. A man placed a button from his father's coat near the base. Someone once brought a candle, but didn't light it and left it upright beside the flame. These were not offerings. They were echoes. Each visitor seemed to feel that they had reached the end of a sentence they hadn't realized they were writing. None took photos. None marked the location on a map. And yet, the number of footprints around the lantern slowly grew, not enough to disturb the earth, but enough to suggest that absence had become a path again. One that didn't need to be paved to be followed. At night, the lantern's flame never danced wildly. It did not pulse like a signal. It simply kept company with the dark. Its light didn't guide, it allowed. Allowed grief. Allowed hope. Allowed the in-between. Those who left never looked back over their shoulders, not out of forgetfulness, but because they felt they were still being seen from behind. Not watched, just remembered. And over time, the story of the lantern was never quite told, but always known. Not in books, not in spoken tales, but in the gentle hush that sometimes entered a person's chest when they paused mid-step and didn't know why. In the dream that left no image, only calm. In the sense, every now and then, that someone had waited for you and was glad you finally came. Years passed. Seasons turned, slowly, gently. The forest softened. The edges of the trees relaxed. Moss grew in new shapes, curves that suggested the outline of an embrace. The lantern remained, not as a relic, but as part of the clearing, as natural and quiet as stone, as wind, as breath. Its flame still burned, though no one questioned how. Not even those who visited now and then, who sometimes sat beside it and felt no need to wonder. The house near the path no longer stood. The walls had quietly folded in, the roof had sighed downward, and what remained was not ruin, but return. Wildflowers grew in its place, ones that only bloomed at dusk, and only when no one was looking directly at them. The gate was gone, yet the edge of the garden remained visible, shaped by the memory of footsteps. And in the earth beneath what had once been a doorstep, the roots of a single tree took hold, tall, slender, with leaves that hummed at night. People rarely spoke of the lantern anymore, not because they had forgotten, but because they no longer needed to ask. The question had been answered in the flame's continued presence. It didn't signal an ending. It never had. It simply stood where love had once been left without a promise, and where waiting had been transformed into peace. And when the sky darkened each evening, somewhere between what had been and what might still come, the lantern's light welcomed nightfall with the gentlest certainty. It had waited long enough, and now it simply stayed. Far away from the clearing where the lantern stood, a woman carried a small notebook in her coat pocket. It had no title, no lines, just a single pressed flower between the pages. She didn't remember where the flower came from, only that she had found it one morning inside her mailbox, resting between a bill and an advertisement, with no note attached. Something about it had made her pause, not because it was beautiful, but because it felt placed, as if someone had gently said, "Here, you might need this." She had slipped it into the notebook without question, and for years it remained there, waiting. The woman had grown used to feeling a presence in her life that she could not explain. It was not divine, not ghostly, just consistent, like a particular warmth in the air when she entered certain rooms, like hearing a melody in the distance when no one else did, like waking up with the sudden clarity that today, of all days, she should turn left instead of right. And on the morning she boarded a train going nowhere in particular, she carried only the notebook, a scarf she hadn't worn in decades, and the soft, unspoken feeling that something long paused was ready to move again. She didn't plan her route. She followed instinct, small decisions guided by almost imperceptible cues. A shadow that lingered too long at a crossroads, a flicker of light seen through trees, a sense that the road had been waiting for her feet to remember it. As she traveled, strangers offered her directions without being asked. Not exact ones, but gestures, glances, a single word like through or beyond. And always, the horizon seemed to tilt toward something unnamed, as though the world itself wanted her to arrive. By the third day, the forest rose before her, not as a wall, but as an invitation. She didn't hesitate. The trees did not obstruct her passage. They made way slowly, deliberately, as if unsure if she was ready, but trusting her all the same. The path beneath her feet felt familiar, though she'd never walked it. The air grew still again, but it was the kind of stillness that made space, not silence. It held her, acknowledged her, and encouraged her to continue, one breath at a time. And then, without announcement, without drama, the clearing appeared. The lantern was already there, just as it had always been, not waiting, not surprised, just steady. And the moment her eyes met its flame, the flower in her notebook crumbled to dust, not in loss, but in completion. She stepped into the clearing slowly, not from fear, but as though her body understood that arrival was not a moment to rush. The lantern flickered gently, not brighter, not in welcome, just alive, present. The ground beneath her shoes was soft, not from recent rain, but from memory. It yielded slightly, like an old friend leaning into an embrace. She didn't speak. There was no need. The silence between her and the flame held more conversation than language ever could. Around her, the trees stood in quiet alignment. The clearing itself bore the subtle signs of previous visitors. Small impressions in the moss, a single button pressed into the soil, a stone carefully placed beside the base of the post. But none of it felt like offering. It felt like presence. Like echoes that never asked to be heard, but continued resonating anyway. She walked a slow arc around the lantern, eyes lowered, fingers trailing lightly through the air, as if tracing the edge of something not quite visible. She paused beside the lantern post. There was no heat from the flame, only warmth. The kind of warmth that remembers. She crouched slowly and touched the soil with her palm, letting it rest there for a long moment. It felt familiar beneath her skin, not in texture, but in recognition. As if her body, more than her mind, knew it had returned to a place that had once mattered deeply. She didn't remember ever being there, but the land seemed to remember her. She opened the notebook and removed the folded paper from its final page, the one she had never dared read until now. The writing inside was faint, as if time itself had tried to erase it, but failed. Only one sentence remained clear. If you ever find your way back, don't knock. Just sit. It wasn't signed, but she smiled anyway, and her hand stopped trembling. So she did. She sat cross-legged on the earth, across from the lantern, back straight, palms open in her lap, her eyes closed, not in fatigue, but in peace. For the first time in years, she felt no pressure to move, no expectation to understand, no ache to explain. The moment did not ask anything of her. It simply held her, and as the first stars pricked through the blue of the coming night, the lantern's flame leaned toward her, gently, slowly, like a flame that had been waiting to remember how to mirror someone else's breath. Night deepened around the clearing, but it brought no darkness. The lantern's light reached just far enough to hold the woman in a gentle circle of gold, leaving the forest beyond cloaked in its quiet mystery. The air grew cooler, but not cold. The ground beneath her seemed to breathe beneath the weight of her stillness, rising slightly with each inhale, settling gently with each exhale, as though sinking itself to the rhythm of her presence. She remained seated, unmoving, not out of discipline, but because there was nowhere else she needed to be. Above her, the sky stretched wide and open, stars scattered not in patterns but in pauses, glimmering like forgotten promises slowly finding their way back into meaning. Somewhere in the distance, the soft call of an unseen bird echoed once, not repeating, not insisting, just reminding. The woman opened her eyes slowly, not startled but guided, and the lantern's flame seemed to pulse once in harmony, as though it too had heard something familiar. She reached forward, not to touch the lantern, but to place the folded page beside it. The edges fluttered slightly, caught in a breeze that hadn't touched her skin. The flame did not move, but it tilted subtly, as if acknowledging the offering, not as a message, not as a request, but as a shared moment. For a long while she stayed that way, hand resting near the note, eyes fixed on the gentle dance of light. Then from the corner of the clearing something stirred, not a creature, not a person, just a shift in the shape of space, as if absence had chosen for a moment to fold back and reveal something older than time, presence without form. The woman didn't look toward it. She simply smiled and breathed more deeply, her shoulders relaxing, her posture softening. She closed her eyes again, and in the quiet that followed, even the trees seemed to exhale. The lantern did not flare. It did not dim. It simply held its flame steady, not between her and the night, but between her and what she carried. The part of her that had always wondered, always wandered, always waited, without knowing for what, had arrived. And in that stillness, it did not ask to be seen. It only asked to rest. The hours passed unnoticed, as if time had loosened its grip in the clearing. The woman remained seated, her body shifting only slightly as the coolness of the earth curled around her. No stiffness crept into her limbs. No fatigue found her shoulders. It was as if the air itself supported her posture, cradling her in a balance between rest and awareness. She felt not watched but accompanied by something that existed not in form, but in the quiet consent of being there, together, without demand. The lantern's flame held steady through the night, and though it did not flicker, its light seemed to move, not in brightness, but in weight. The glow leaned inward now, warmer, as though reaching toward the woman without crossing the space between them. It illuminated the folded page beside its base with a soft amber tone, and though no one would read the words again, the light itself seemed to memorize them. Beyond the clearing, the world remained untouched. The stars did not fall. The wind did not rise. But something deep in the soil had changed. A settling, perhaps, or a surrender. In the woman's chest, something released. A feeling she had carried too long without shape, something like longing, but older, quieter, began to dissolve. Not in a rush, not in a flood, but the way snow melts when the sun returns after many months. Slowly, respectfully. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. But her eyes grew soft, and the corners of her lips curved into a smile that had no audience. It was a smile meant for a memory that never needed to be recalled, only honored. She reached for the scarf around her shoulders, the one she'd carried for decades without ever knowing why. Her fingers unfolded it slowly and laid it on the ground beside the lantern. The flame responded, not with movement, but with stillness, as if receiving something sacred. She whispered nothing. She asked for nothing. She simply left it there, in the quiet certainty that it belonged. And then gently she stood. She didn't walk away immediately. She stood in the center of the clearing, letting her breath match the air around her, her feet resting lightly on the softened earth. The lantern behind her cast a long shadow across the moss, but it didn't follow her. It remained behind, watching without expectation. She turned slowly, one last glance not for confirmation, but for gratitude. The flame swayed slightly in return, not as farewell, but as blessing. As she stepped back toward the forest, the trees parted once more, their branches bending subtly overhead, not closing in, but guiding. The path she walked now was clearer than before, not marked, but known. With each step, the world became a little louder. Birdsong resumed, leaves rustled faintly. The distant sound of water flowing reached her ears for the first time in what felt like years, but none of it felt intrusive. It was as though the world had waited quietly for her to remember herself, and now it welcomed her gently back into motion. She walked without looking behind her, not out of denial, but because she no longer needed to. The clearing was not left behind. It was carried forward in her pace, in her posture, in the new hush that lived behind her eyes. The folded notebook remained in her coat pocket, now weightless. And though the pressed flower was gone, its imprint remained on the page like a thumbprint of time. She would not open it again. She would not need to. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, the sun had risen. The light that filtered through the leaves touched her differently now, not like a spotlight, but like recognition. The village below appeared as it always had, quiet and unchanged, but she walked into it with the grace of someone who had been rewoven from silence. She didn't speak of where she had been. No one asked, but in the way she set her teacup down, in the way she smiled at a passing stranger, in the way she paused at doorways before entering, something new lingered, and the lantern far behind her continued to burn. Years later, a child wandered to the edge of the woods, chasing the echo of a dream she had no words for. Her feet moved with purpose she didn't understand, as if she were retracing steps that had not been hers. She found the path easily, though it was overgrown in places, and walked it without fear, her small fingers grazing tree bark, her breath quiet. When the clearing opened before her, she did not gasp. She simply stopped and stared, the way one does when seeing a place they know before knowing how they know it. The lantern stood just as it always had, its flame alive and gentle. Beside it, the scarf remained, untouched by time, draped in the shape of someone who once chose to let go. The child approached, her eyes wide, her steps careful. She didn't speak. She sat, cross-legged, quiet, still. The flame swayed slightly toward her, not in surprise, not in recognition, but in welcome. And as she sat there, something in the earth beneath her pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat remembering its rhythm. She stayed for a long time, not waiting for anything, just being. And when she rose, she left nothing behind, but the clearing held her presence anyway, folding it gently into its memory. She walked back the way she came, humming a tune she hadn't known before but would never forget. And in the stillness of that sacred place, the lantern burned on. The clearing had never needed time, yet time had always passed through it like breath through an open door, unannounced, unnoticed, and somehow always invited. The lantern did not mark its passing with smoke or ash. It simply burned, as steady in the third decade as it had been in the first evening. Its flame was no longer a question, nor a signal, nor a vigil. It had become a companion to the place itself, a quiet continuity that asked nothing, and answered more than words ever could. By now, the clearing was no longer hidden. It was not on any map, but those who needed to find it always did. They came rarely, never in a crowd, one at a time. A man who had forgotten how to grieve, a girl who had never known quiet, a woman who carried a key to a door that no longer existed. They did not speak while they were there, and none of them ever brought company. They left with nothing in their hands, but with something lighter in their chests, an unmeasurable exhale that made walking easier afterward. Some brought tokens, a ribbon, a feather, a photograph folded too many times, and placed them not at the base of the lantern, but in the surrounding moss, letting the earth decide what to keep. One visitor came barefoot, saying nothing as he walked circles around the lantern, brushing the tips of the grass with his fingers. Another came only to lie on the ground and look upward, tears slipping silently into the soil. None of them spoke to the flame, and the flame never responded with drama or brilliance. It simply glowed with the patience of something that had witnessed both joy and sorrow, and found no need to separate them. The forest never aged around it. The trees grew, yes, but never overreached. The sky above never clouded fully. Rain passed gently through the clearing, never extinguishing, never interrupting. Animals avoided the center, but some would pause at its edge, ears forward, breath slowed, before continuing on. Even the wind grew quieter near the post, as though reminded that some places are not meant to be disturbed, only honored. And on a night when the moon rose slowly, casting a silver hush over the woods, a young boy arrived. He had not come by road or trail. He had wandered through sleep, through ache, through questions too heavy for someone his age. When he stepped into the clearing, he carried nothing, but his eyes held the weight of something unnamed. And the lantern, seeing him, not with eyes but with knowing, burned just a little closer to the ground, like a hand reaching out without urgency, simply to say, "You are not alone." The boy stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. His small frame was barely visible beneath the folds of a coat too big for him, the sleeves hiding his hands, the hem brushing against his ankles. He didn't move forward at first, as though unsure if the place would accept him, or if stepping further would break whatever quiet thing was holding everything in place. But the flame did not recoil. It waited, the way a door waits to be opened, not because it is locked, but because it understands timing. Eventually, the boy stepped forward, cautiously at first, then more surely, guided not by knowledge but by something quieter, an internal nudge that whispered, "This is safe." He did not sit. He did not cry. He simply walked around the lantern in a slow, uneven circle, as if trying to understand it from every angle. The light followed his movement, not by turning, but by allowing. Wherever he stood, the glow reached him, not as a spotlight, but as presence. He stopped in front of the post and tilted his head upward, staring into the flame with eyes that carried more silence than a child's should. Whatever had brought him here hadn't spoken its name. Perhaps it didn't need to. Perhaps it had been carried in his bones since birth, the way some children carry stories they've never been told. The clearing seemed to breathe with him, syncing its rhythm to the small rise and fall of his shoulders. The boy reached into his coat and pulled out a stone, smooth, dark, polished by many hours of turning it over in his palm. It wasn't heavy, but it held weight. He knelt slowly and placed it at the base of the post, just beside where the scarf still lay. The stone didn't roll. It settled immediately, as though the ground had known it was coming. He didn't speak to it. He didn't even look at it again. His part was done. Then, without rising, he sat cross-legged before the lantern, hands resting gently in his lap. The flame didn't flicker. It leaned slightly toward him and held there, like a breath paused in the space between words. And the boy closed his eyes. Not in sleep, not in surrender, but in peace. He had arrived. And for now, that was enough. The boy remained in the clearing as the hours stretched, yet nothing about him seemed restless. He didn't fidget. He didn't yawn. He simply sat, as if he had known all along how to be still in the presence of something sacred. Around him, the forest accepted his presence with quiet ease. The branches above didn't sway. The moss beneath him didn't shift. Even the small creatures watching from the edge seemed to understand that his being there wasn't intrusion. It was belonging. In time, he opened his eyes. Not quickly, not suddenly, but like someone waking in a place they already understood. His gaze met the lantern's flame again, and in that meeting, something soft passed between them. There was no message, no revelation, just the warmth of recognition. He reached out slowly, not to touch the flame, but to hover his hand beside it, close enough to feel its gentle heat. It was not the kind of heat that burned. It was the kind that remembered. Then, from the folds of his coat, he pulled a folded piece of paper, crumpled, worn, stained with time. He didn't unfold it. He didn't need to. He simply looked at it one last time, then placed it gently at the base of the post, beside the stone he had brought earlier. The paper fluttered slightly in the still air, then settled perfectly still, as though it too had found its place. He stood slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. The clearing didn't shift with him. It remained steady, as though it had known he would not stay long. He looked around once more, not out of curiosity, but with the kind of farewell that needs no words. His eyes paused on the scarf, then on the roots beneath it, then on the flame, and then he turned. As he walked away, the lantern did not flicker. It did not fade. It simply held its glow, watching the space he left behind, not with longing, but with quiet pride. The boy did not look back. He didn't need to. The memory of the flame had already folded itself into him, tucked somewhere just beneath the ribs, where quiet things often stay until they're needed again. And when he reached the forest's edge, the trees parted one last time, not with drama, but with reverence. After the boy left, the clearing held still for a long while. Not empty, never empty, but balanced, as though exhaled. The flame in the lantern burned exactly as before, but those who had known it long would have noticed something different. A quiet deepening, a shift in tone. Not brighter, not dimmer, just fuller. The kind of light that had held so many arrivals, so many silences, that it had become more than illumination. It had become memory, suspended in form. Around the base of the post, the objects left behind by others remained where they had always been. Stone, scarf, folded paper. But they no longer looked like separate things. They looked like part of the place itself, as integral as the roots beneath the moss, as natural as the light above. They were not tributes. They were pieces of the same breath, scattered gently into matter. Nothing aged, nothing decayed. Even time in that place seemed to step more softly. In a village far beyond the woods, a man felt a sudden warmth on the back of his hand as he reached for his keys. He paused, confused for a moment, then continued about his day without speaking of it. Elsewhere, a woman rose earlier than usual, stirred by a sound she could not name. She stood by the window, watching the first light stretch across her floor, and whispered, "I remember," though she couldn't say what. In a distant town, A stranger lit a candle at the edge of their garden, though they didn't know why. These things happened quietly, sporadically, and always without explanation. The lantern did not call to them. It didn't need to. Its flame had already reached them, carried not through roads or maps, but through the silent threads that tie moments together across years. It was no longer about waiting. It had become something else, presence that lingers, even when the room is empty. A hush that remains after music ends, holding all that was felt in a space that now listens. Bird song returned to the trees slowly, one note at a time. Not loud, not insistent, just enough to say the forest was listening again. The sky above, cloudless and open, bore the kind of blue that feels like breath held just before a smile. And beneath it all, the flame kept burning, soft and sure, in the center of a story that no longer needed a beginning or an end. The seasons continued to shift around the clearing, though none of them ever changed it. In spring, new growth crept close, but never overstepped. Wildflowers bloomed in soft clusters, their colors muted as though out of respect. In summer, the trees rustled with a kind of quiet joy, but the breeze always stilled near the lantern's post. Autumn brought a golden hush, leaves falling in wide arcs, settling around the base like blankets gently folded. And in winter, the snow returned, not harshly, but as a hush upon hush, forming a delicate ring that never covered the flame. No caretaker ever came. No one cleaned, trimmed, or repaired, and yet nothing crumbled, nothing faded. The lantern never rusted, its glass never smudged. The post stood as straight as it had on the first day, unbowed by wind, untouched by rot. Even the earth beneath it remained soft but firm, as though it had learned how to hold something eternal. People wondered how. Some whispered theories. Others chose to accept. But those who came never asked. They knew better than to question something that had already answered in silence. There were times when the clearing stood empty for months. No footsteps, no offerings, just the flame and the forest and the great unbroken sky. But even in those stretches of solitude, the lantern did not waver. Its purpose was not dependent on audience. It had transcended the act of waiting. It had become witness. And there is a kind of sacredness in bearing witness without demand, without praise, simply because something once mattered enough to remain. One evening, a fog drifted in low and thick. The world outside the clearing disappeared beneath its weight, but the flame shone through it all, not slicing it, not pushing it back, but becoming part of it. The fog moved around the light like a story retelling itself, remembering each twist and pause. For hours, nothing stirred. The world outside could have ended, and the clearing would not have known. It existed now beyond weather, beyond time. A center point, not of geography, but of meaning. And when the fog lifted, just before dawn, the clearing exhaled again. The lantern glowed softly in the morning dim, a beacon not of guidance, but of welcome. Its flame reflected on the surfaces of the tokens left behind, casting faint halos around the scarf, the button, the folded page, the stone. It didn't ask who had left them. It didn't ask why. It only remembered. There came a day, though no one marked it and no calendar could name it, when something in the clearing shifted in a way no eyes could see. The lantern still burned, the trees still stood, the moss still curled softly along the roots. But the air had changed, not in weight nor temperature, but in fullness. As if every breath the flame had ever watched, every silence it had ever held, every arrival and departure it had ever witnessed, had finally settled into one long, complete exhale. Nothing announced it, nothing moved, yet the clearing felt whole. It wasn't an ending. Endings suggest absence, but there was no absence here. If anything, the place had become more itself, more lantern than flame, more flame than light, more light than memory. The boundary between what had been and what was now had dissolved. Visitors still came, not as often, not as urgently, but with a different energy, less seeking, more listening. They sat longer. They brought nothing. They left with less weight in their bones. One woman arrived barefoot, hands empty, and stayed until the stars filled the sky. When she left, she whispered nothing into the night, but the flame bent gently in the direction she walked, as if nodding farewell to a part of itself. By then, the clearing had become a place no one spoke about directly. People referred to it in gestures, in unfinished sentences. "You know, that place," they would begin, and others would nod. No one needed details. Everyone understood. Children drew it without realizing what they were sketching. Circles of light, trees leaning inward, a single shape in the center with no face but all expression. Elders sometimes paused mid-sentence, their eyes growing distant, and smile faintly for no reason. These things continued scattered across towns and lifetimes, like pollen drifting beyond where the forest ever reached. The lantern never extinguished. No storm ever tested it. No hand ever replaced its flame. And yet it remained, day after day, year after year, carrying not fire, but memory shaped into glow. It no longer waited. It no longer hoped. It no longer bore the weight of longing. It simply was. And in being, it welcomed everything that came. At the edge of the world, not in distance, but in meaning, there are places that forget how to disappear. Places that become more real, not with time, but with memory. The clearing was one of them. It no longer needed the lantern to mark it. Yet the lantern still burned, a quiet continuity not out of duty, but desire. A desire to be present, to remain when everything else passed through. It no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. It carried only the lightness of having been part of many answers that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. In a distant town, a young man who had never known the lantern found himself waking earlier each morning, with the same dream lingering just beyond reach. It was always the same, a soft glow in the dark, the sound of leaves breathing, the sense that someone had just left or was just about to arrive. He told no one. He didn't need to. The feeling followed him through his day, wrapping itself around his thoughts like the memory of a song without melody. And though he never spoke of it, he began walking differently, slower, more deliberately, as though each step might bring him closer to something his body already remembered. Elsewhere, an older woman found a note tucked between pages of a book she hadn't opened in decades. She didn't recognize the handwriting. It wasn't hers. It read only, "Some lights wait not for people, but for moments." She held the note for a long time, fingers trembling slightly, then folded it once and placed it back inside. That night, she lit a candle in her kitchen and let it burn all the way down, watching the wax pool and harden in silence. She didn't look away the entire time. The lantern, in its clearing, flickered once that evening, just once. Not as a signal, not as change, but as acknowledgement, like a nod given across great distance when no other gesture will do. The trees remained still, the air soft, the sky above wide with stars, and beneath it, the flame glowed steady, not for the forest, not for the visitors, not for the stories it once held. It burned now for the quiet between things, the pause before the final note, the breath that follows forgiveness, the echo that stays after the door has closed. And if someone were to step into the clearing at that very moment, they might not have seen anything remarkable. Just a lantern, a few scattered leaves, and the hush of a forest content in its stillness. But if they stayed long enough, if they listened carefully, they might feel the world lean in. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. The clearing held that kind now, a silence not of still air or sleeping trees, but of things understood so deeply that they no longer needed names. The lantern's flame, quiet as ever, had become part of this silence. It didn't illuminate so much as it revealed, not the shapes of things, but their presence. Visitors still came now and then, drawn not by stories, but by instinct. They stayed shorter, spoke less, and left behind nothing the eye could see. Yet the clearing felt their presence in subtle ways, a shift in the temperature of moss, the slight leaning of the flame, a new shadow forming and then fading before dusk. One woman came carrying nothing but a breath she hadn't exhaled in years. She stood beside the post, eyes wide with something too large for sorrow and too soft for joy. She touched the wood once, not to claim it, but to recognize it. And when she left, the lantern bent toward where her hand had been. Another visitor came not on foot, but through thought alone. An old man resting in a quiet room, eyes closed, breathing slow. His mind drifted to a light he had never seen, yet somehow knew. The flame flickered once that night, brief and low, like a reply whispered back across great distance. The objects around the post had faded into the ground now. Not lost, absorbed. The stone, the button, the folded notes had returned to earth as quietly as they had arrived. But their essence remained. The clearing didn't need to hold them visibly. They were part of its rhythm now, like chords absorbed into the wood of a well-played instrument. Every breeze that passed through the trees carried the scent of memory. Every patch of sunlight that filtered to the moss felt like a gesture, like a hand extended in kindness without needing to be seen. The flame, which had once carried so much waiting, now held only peace. It didn't reach. It didn't call. It welcomed. Its glow had become a kind of still music, playing beneath the surface of things, a note held so long it no longer needed to resolve. And in its warmth there lived a quiet understanding that not all stories need to end, and not all light needs a reason to burn. That evening, when the stars returned and the wind lay down among the roots, the clearing rested deeper into itself. The lantern's flame dipped low, then rose again, not as movement, but as breath. And for a moment, the entire forest seemed to pause, not in suspense, but in reverence, as if remembering together that some things are kept not by holding on, but by simply never letting go. In time, even the idea of the lantern became difficult to separate from the clearing itself. It was no longer an object within a place. It was the place. Its presence shaped the very way sound moved, how the wind paused before entering, how the light curved along the moss at midday. And those who came to it, whether by foot or by thought or by dream, did not describe it afterward. They couldn't. Not because it was mysterious, but because it was complete. To speak of it would have required unraveling something already perfectly woven. Children, as always, sensed it first. Some wandered through woods and stumbled into it with wide eyes and quiet mouths. Others sat on porches or beside windows, suddenly overcome with the feeling that something important had just happened somewhere they could not see. They would stare into space for long minutes, as if a part of them had traveled far and come back carrying something too fragile to unwrap just yet. Parents noticed, smiled gently, and said nothing. There was no need. Some understandings are inherited in silence. Elders, too, found their way again, some through dreams that left them waking with tears they couldn't name. Others while walking familiar routes that suddenly felt unfamiliar, as though they had turned a wrong corner and found themselves in a memory. And there were those who didn't move at all, but felt a warmth at their backs as they sat alone, as if someone had pulled a blanket of presence across their shoulders. They would sit up straighter, breathe more slowly, and close their eyes with the calm of being seen. The forest accepted all of it, the comings and goings, the visits and visions. It had grown wise in the company of the lantern. It no longer reached outward. It held inward. Its roots thickened beneath the earth like chords of an old song deepening in tone. Its canopy stretched not higher, but closer, drawing together above the clearing as if to protect something not from harm, but from forgetting. And the clearing glowed not from the flame alone, but from what the flame had come to mean. One night, a shooting star arced across the sky, slicing briefly through the dark. It cast no reflection on the glass of the lantern. The flame did not respond. But something in the ground shifted, lightly, lovingly, like a nod, like a smile. The clearing did not move, it never needed to, but it felt in that moment more vast than ever. And at the heart of it, the lantern burned on, unchanged, unwavering, and utterly at peace. There came a time when no footsteps found their way to the clearing for a very long while. The world outside had quickened. Roads widened, voices grew louder, days became crowded with urgency. People no longer paused before entering doorways. Lights stayed on even after no one needed them. Waiting became uncomfortable, and silence began to feel like absence instead of presence. And so, the clearing was left to itself, not forgotten, just unread for a while, like a well-worn page quietly closed in a beloved book. Yet the lantern did not falter. Its flame, long past the need for fuel or witness, continued to glow with the same quiet rhythm it always had. The post remained steady, and the air still held the scent of old wood and faint warmth. The moss thickened slightly along the edges of the path, but never crept across the space where others had once sat. It was as if the clearing had learned patience from the lantern, and now practiced it faithfully in return. The forest around it deepened in texture. Leaves gathered where no wind could move them. Roots thickened in silence, and above the sky grew used to the way stars seemed to shine just a little brighter when passing over that patch of earth. Nothing changed. Everything remained. And still, the clearing waited, not as it once had, with yearning or hope, but with the kind of settled stillness that understands presence as enough. On a distant hill, an old woman sat on a bench and suddenly turned her head, for no reason she could name. Her breath caught, her heart slowed, and a single tear fell, not from sadness but from remembering something she hadn't known she'd forgotten. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Still there," and her voice joined the hush of 1,000 others who had once felt the flame's quiet welcome. She never told anyone what she meant, but that evening she lit a candle and placed it on her windowsill, letting it burn through the night. And far away, beyond hills and roads and noise, the lantern flickered once, not in reply but in resonance, a single note sustained across space and time. Eventually, someone came again. A young girl this time, walking slowly, her hands deep in her coat pockets, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She did not seem to be searching, but the forest opened for her all the same, as if it recognized something in her step. An old rhythm, a quiet ache. The path had nearly vanished, yet her feet found it without hesitation. She walked as though led by something older than direction, something carried not in the mind but in the marrow. When she reached the clearing, she stopped only briefly at its edge. Then she stepped in, not cautiously but gently, the way one enters a room where someone is already sleeping. The lantern stood before her, just as it had for those who came before. She did not gasp. She did not question. She simply smiled, slow and soft, as if meeting someone who had kept a promise no one else remembered. She approached and sat cross-legged in the moss, her hands resting loosely on her knees. The flame, steady as ever, leaned slightly in her direction. Not as greeting, not as surprise, but as if saying, "Of course." She didn't bring a stone or a note or a name, but she brought something else, something the flame recognized immediately, silence that had not yet found where to rest. And now it had. She closed her eyes. The forest held its breath. The world outside continued in its rush. But inside the clearing, time folded softly inward, like a blanket wrapped around a moment. And once again, the lantern burned in the company of presence. If one were to map all the places where something sacred still lingers, the clearing might not appear, but it would be felt. In the soft pause before speaking, in the light that touches a floor in late afternoon, in the feeling sometimes that you are not alone, even when no one else is in the room. The lantern was never meant to be a monument. It was a practice, a continuation of something begun long before names, sustained long after memory. It did not teach. It did not explain. But those who came left changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, just a little more still, a little more kind, a little more able to wait without knowing what for. They carried the flame in the way they held door handles, in the way they listened to silence, in the way they paused before extinguishing a candle, as if honoring something that had chosen to stay lit long after it needed to. The lantern never asked for legacy. It had no story etched in stone, no ritual surrounding it, but it endured, not through will, but through welcome. And that welcome spread, not as doctrine, but as tone, a hum beneath words, a warmth beneath gestures, a breath between generations. And one day, long after the last visitor had come and gone, the clearing stood in the same hush it always had. The flame, still and small, cast a golden circle across the moss. The trees bowed gently overhead, and the stars blinked awake above. Nothing needed to happen. Nothing was waiting. Everything was exactly as it was meant to be. And in the quiet heart of it all, the lantern stayed, lit, alive, home,